process where basically anybody can file a petition with FDA. They're generally in letter form. You know, they're First Amendment protected. You have the right to do this. They are governed by the Administrative Procedures Act. So when FDA makes a decision, if you need to challenge that decision, you can challenge it in court through the Administrative Procedures Act. And we set out in the slides here the different provisions, the regulatory provisions that govern them. Now, you know, these can be really directed toward any issue, and you will see some public interest groups just presenting some public health and safety. What we'll really focus on today and what drives a lot of this are petitions by companies relating to a number of different issues, and they can be aimed at FDA's regulations themselves or asking FDA to take or refrain from taking sorts of action. Now, what's really interesting, and part of this goes to how competitive the pharmaceutical industry has gone, is that petitions are used much more frequently, and particularly as we're going to focus on the pharmaceutical, much more frequently in the pharmaceutical industry. We just presented a little bit of information here. Basically, over the last little bit over a decade, the number of petitions have doubled, and you see in particular in the chart that's here on slide 3 are the number of petitions aimed at pharmaceutical products, and you'll see actually in about a decade they really tripled. Now, you know, what that means is that companies need to be very familiar with this process, need to be attuned to it, and realize both how to use it and how to work with the system. Wanted to address a couple issues, again, by way of background on petitions. As we saw, as the number of petitions were increasing, there was also a growing concern that petitions were sometimes being filed on frivolous bases with no real grounds, and at least a concern that was voiced to Congress by a lot of groups and the generic pharmaceutical industry is that they were delaying approvals, particularly of generic products. So what we saw in 2007, Congress passed what I and a lot of people refer to as FDAA, the Food and Drug Administration Amendments Act. And what that really put into place was this Section 505Q, which governs petitions, and there was provisions of foreign petitions, but this changed some of the provisions. Basically set out some statutory deadlines for FDA, giving FDA 180 days to respond to petitions, but also said that applications, you know, particularly usually these were ANDAs, could not be delayed due to a petition unless a delay was necessary to protect public health. And, you know, Congress also put into place a system whereby FDA would continue to inform Congress basically of how things were going. As things moved along, what we really saw was FDA continued to get more and more petitions and was, you know, I don't want to say just as slow, but was having a difficult time responding to petitions, and also a greater need and desire by the industry to get these petitions decided quicker. So in 2012, what I typically refer to as FDASIA, the Food and Drug Administration Safety and Innovation Act, was passed. And that actually shortened the deadline from 180 days to 150 days. Now, what FDA said about this is, you know, Congress, that was great, but really what you did was you made our problem in responding to petitions even worse, because now we have a shorter statutory window in which to decide these, and we need to then redirect resources from other initiatives to do that. It's hard to tell if these new shorter deadlines will have an impact on actually speeding substantive responses from FDA. But certainly what we've seen is FDA providing a greater number of non-substantive responses. Often saying,
we'll also say we're just taking it under advisement or some bullshit statement. Yeah.
Matt, I don't know if that's you or somebody else. I guess I'm getting a lot of feedback from somebody else. If somebody could mute their phones, that'd be great. Sorry about that, everybody. Anyways, so we're getting more and more FDA responding saying it's premature, it's too early, and we'll take it under advisement and get back to you, which obviously for everybody in the industry is really, really disheartening and doesn't necessarily help the process. So turning now to specific petitions and some of the more hot-button issues that have been going on in FDA in 2013, wanted to focus on a few. First are the requirements relating to abuse deterrent opioid drugs. Another have been a couple decisions relating to REMS. And then finally, and this has been pretty common, about exclusivity challenges, and particularly we're going to focus on new chemical entity exclusivity, but over the years there have been challenges to a number of different marketing exclusivities. So first, just focusing on, and really this is two different products in which FDA over the last few years has dealt with issues of opioid drug abuse. And as you may know, some of these products, and OxyContin has probably been the poster child, at least getting the most press out there, in terms of being abused, being highly abused, and being a highly addictive product. So what we saw is that companies pushed on by Congress, pushed on by the market as well, and pushed on by FDA, have focused some efforts on developing what have been usually deemed abuse deterrent versions. And they do this in a number of different ways. OxyContin was one of the earlier ones to come out with a new formulation. And the general idea, it was to make it harder for drug abusers to abuse it. They sought a label change for the OxyContin in April based on different clinical studies that were out there. So what you saw was the branded company Purdue there changed its formulation and put on the market a different formulation, which was this abuse deterrent formulation. Well, as one might expect, this led to a number of petitions being filed with FDA. And basically there were a couple different things. The first were the generic companies asking FDA to decide that the original OxyContin was not withdrawn for safety or effectiveness reasons. And the reason for this is that a generic can't be marketed of a branded product if the branded product was removed from the market for a safety or efficacy reason. There was then a petition filed requesting that FDA not approve generic versions of the reformulated OxyContin, the abuse deterrent OxyContin, unless they were similarly able to prove that it was the same in terms of its abuse resistance. And that's a pretty big difference in terms of how FDA typically looks at drug formulations, because typically FDA is trying to look at, do you have the same active ingredient? Do you behave the same in the body in terms of, at least for oral ingested products, it's typically looking at the amount of active ingredient in the blood over certain periods of time. And that usually ended the inquiry, and obviously you're complying with CGMP and everything else, and making a stable product. But FDA hadn't traditionally looked at other performance characteristics of the product. So Purdue asked that FDA do that for this product, and that the generics that were tailored toward the abuse-resistant formulation prove up that they had similar characteristics. Purdue also then, in responding to the generic generic petitions, said that the product was withdrawn for safety or efficacy reasons, and essentially pointed to this new abuse resistance as being something that was better and safer on the market. There was a second round of petitions relating to a different opioid product called Opana ER. And again, the idea here with Opana is it was being abused as well, similar to OxyContin, at least in terms of the drug abusers who were using it. It's a different product, but had similar abuse issues. And the brand company there also reformulated that to put an abuse deterrent formulation on the market. And as with OxyContin, discontinued the earlier marketing, the marketing of the earlier product, marketing just the abuse-resistant formulation. And again, you had similar petitions being filed, one asking FDA to determine that the original NDA was withdrawn for safety or efficacy reasons, and the other requesting that FDA not approve generic versions unless those generic versions also demonstrated an abuse-resistant aspect to them that was similar to Opana. So the interesting thing with these is that FDA came to different conclusions, at least in terms of the overall decisions of what FDA was doing for the two different products. the original FDA decided that the original OxyContin was withdrawn for safety or effectiveness reasons, and said, if you compare the original formulation to the reformulation had an increased ability to resist crushing, breaking, and other ways in which it's used by drug abusers. But FDA came to the opposite conclusion with Opana, said it wasn't withdrawn for reasons of safety and efficacy, and that generics could then be continued to market to be on the market, generic versions of the original formulation. And basically what FDA was focusing on were the studies that were submitted for the two different products in terms of the abuse-resistant characteristics. So what do we take away from this? What do we learn from looking at these two, what people would consider opposite conclusions? Especially in light of what was going on with the petitions and everything else. First, that FDA may be open to rejecting premature applications or petitions when FDA determines that it may need more time to look at an issue. And what you really see is when FDA says, well, we can't do it in the 150 days or the 180 days, we need a lot more time. I will tell you personally, it can be a very, very frustrating process. You really can't get a great look at what FDA is doing behind the curtain, and often you can scratch your head wondering why it's taking so long. The other thing, though, focusing on these abuse-resistant formulations, and we mentioned two of these in two of these different products, but there are a number of products that are either out in the market or coming out in the market that are designed to be abuse-resistant, and they go across really a number of different actives, obviously focusing a lot on the pain medications, but also focusing on some of the ADHD and other medications. And what people in the industry need to focus on is that the abuse potential is really going to be weighed, and there's going to be a risk-benefit profile. And to the extent that the innovators can demonstrate through clinical studies about the abuse-resistant qualities and the improvement in those qualities, they're going to have a better shot at getting FDA to determine that only these abuse-resistant characteristics or products with those abuse-resistant characteristics can be on the market. And also you want to focus on the product labels as well. When the brand product is able to get abuse-deterrent characteristics actually onto the label, they're going to have a better chance of requiring the generic products to also demonstrate those qualities and also get those qualities on the labels. So switching gears a little bit to a different kind of petition, and there's a couple we're going to focus on here relating to a different issue, relates to the issue of REMS. I don't know to the extent you're familiar with these, but FDA and really through acts of Congress developed what they call REMS, which stands for Risk Evaluation and Mitigation Strategies. And tied in with REMS are then these, and you see it abbreviated here, ETASU, elements to assure safe use. And what these really relate to are products that have some sort of issue with them in terms typically of their safety profiles. And a lot of these are products that need to be marketed to a more a smaller population in terms of the disease. A lot of times you need to have greater monitoring in terms of how the patients are doing and a greater focus on how those patients are reacting, both from an effectiveness and especially from a safety perspective. So FDA has increasingly, with new products, been implementing these REMS and these elements to assure safe use with various products. The problem with that, at least from the perspective of the generic companies and just from the perspective of the whole way the generic market operates, is sometimes and increasingly the REMS are getting in the way of the generic company's ability to obtain product samples to conduct bioequivalent studies. And just to talk about that generally, so generally you have a product that's out in the market. When generic companies need them, they can go to a distributor, they can buy them, then they put them into the bio studies, they run the patient studies, and see how the generic product lines up. Well, the problem with the REMS is often you can't just go to a distributor and buy these products. You need to have very specific prescriptions. They need to have certain monitoring. Sometimes only certain types of doctors and facilities can actually administer these products. So The result of that has been a couple of different petitions aimed at solving that problem, for lack of a better word. And one of the earlier ones was this Dr. Reddy's petition we mentioned here, which was filed in 2009. Dr. Reddy's listed a couple products, phthalimide and Revlimid, as examples where these restricted distributions can potentially get in the way of generic companies obtaining the product. And what Dr. Reddy sought from FDA was a couple different things. One was getting guidance on how they can go about getting FDA's help in obtaining products. And essentially what Dr. Reddy's was trying to do is get FDA to issue guidance saying that if you submit certain characteristics in your biostudy protocol, certain things in the biostudy protocol, to demonstrate that the protocol would comply with the REMS, trying to get FDA to agree to a system where FDA would write letters basically endorsing those bioequivalence protocols, and that would then allow the generics to obtain the product. Dr. Reddy's also asked that certain statements could be implemented in every REMS system, that the REMS couldn't be used to delay or block generic competition. Dr. Reddy's also sought the FDA's help in enforcing those provisions, and also referring complaints to FTC where products weren't able to be obtained due to the REMS. Well, in August of last year, which, as you can see just here, this is another good example of a petition taking a long time to work its way through FDA. FDA granted and denied this in part. And, I also say this is also slightly, something that you'll see that you don't necessarily get not only all the relief you requested, but sometimes you don't get a lot of relief at all. Here, basically what FDA says is that it intends to issue a guidance talking about or clarifying the process for getting these letters so that bioequivalence protocols could be essentially approved, and then allowing the generic companies to use those letters to obtain product directly from the brand companies. But FDA declined to amend the wording of any REMS to say that it couldn't be used to block generic access to products. And it declined to enforce the FDCA Act, which actually says the REMS can't be used to delay or block generic competition. In doing that, FDA actually said, well, in part that's within our enforcement discretion. We're not going to, by petition, address enforcement discretion issues. But in part, the FDA and some folks in the industry have questioned whether FDA even has authority to enforce this upon branded companies. FDA did say that it will continue to refer complaints to the FTC when it feels that's appropriate. Now, another issue that's come up with REMS deals with when you need to have the same elements in REMS for the generic product as you have for the branded product. Very generally, as we say here, FDAA calls for a use of a single shared system unless there's a reason for FDA to grant a waiver. So if you think about this for products, that means products with REMS that branded companies and their generic counterparts need to basically negotiate and come up with a single shared system. Well, Prometheus had this example where they were dealing with Axinn and said that they were having problems negotiating that. And in May of 2013, they filed this petition with FDA. And there were a number of different elements in the REMS program for Lotronox, which was the product at issue. And Prometheus was asking FDA's help, essentially, to get this done. And what you'll see here, Prometheus was asking FDA to go through the notice and comment system and issue rules to address how these shared elements of REMS could be put in place. And what Prometheus recognized in its petition is that there have only been a handful of drugs where the single system has put in place, and none of them, Prometheus said, involved patent litigation going on at the same time. Because if you think about this, when there's paragraph 4 litigation going on, the whole system would look at this and say, well, during that litigation, or when that litigation is resolved, but before the generic comes to market, the parties need to cooperate and come up with a single REMS system. You can imagine how difficult that can be if you're in the middle of a very heated patent litigation. So Prometheus said, this really poses a problem, and FDA, we want you to help work this through. And Prometheus identified another potential, or two other potential issues. One is with the antitrust laws. If the companies, which essentially are competitors, are talking about and discussing a shared system to market or monitor the marketing of what should be competitive products, Prometheus is concerned about FTC raising issues and antitrust issues being raised. And also Prometheus was concerned with product liability issues, because as you may be aware, certain courts have found, certain lower courts particularly, have found the branded companies to be liable when generic products were taken by patients and patients were injured. So Prometheus was worried about the same thing potentially happening when you implement a shared REMS system. Well, in October 2013, FDA, again, one of these granted in parts and denied in parts, ruled on the petition. And essentially, again, not necessarily providing all that much comfort to anybody. He said, well, we're considering a guidance or regulation which would help get this done. And, did say that there are a number of ways in which these shared systems have come about in the past. Talked about multiple sponsors forming a working group and FDA working with that. Also talked about creating shared systems where participants are working together and sharing materials basically in a common database, as often happens in different deals. But FDA didn't deal with the harder issues. What's come up in the past, cost sharing, different business issues with how you actually govern and oversight to this shared system. And FDA really just suggests that the antitrust concerns be raised with FTC, which doesn't necessarily help anybody in the industry. FDA did address how you can actually change some of these provisions. But at the end of the day, what FDA said, well, it's your responsibility under statute to negotiate and create the system, and parties have done it in the past. So at the end of the day, FDA was essentially stepping aside, saying, yeah, it might issue some guidance, but it doesn't have too much to offer right now. Well, an interesting thing has developed from these set of petitions, that they haven't just now been petitions. We've actually now seen some litigation. And we mentioned here this Axinn litigation, which was filed in September of 2012, but led to some significant activity in 2013. And essentially, this involved two different products, Tractglare and Zavesa. And in these instances, Axinn refused to provide product to generics, saying that, well, our REMS and the elements to assure safe use prevent us from supplying them to you. And there was a lot of back and forth, a lot of threats over litigation. So Axinn actually initiated a declaratory judgment action saying that our activity in refusing to sell to you does not violate the antitrust laws. The generics had essentially said, these, citing the essential facilities doctrine and prior course of dealing, said that your refusal to deal with us violates the antitrust laws. And the FTC even joined in, filing an amicus brief on behalf of the generic side. In October of this year, the district court ruled on some of the preliminary motions and essentially said the case is going to go forward, that the judge would like to see, would like to see discovery on these issues. There have been recent reports of some of the generic parties settling on at least some of these products at issue. And what we've seen in the press is some of the parties saying that they have worked out with FDA, the generics have worked out with FDA, getting approval for their protocols, and that Axinn may be willing to now sell them some products. So it will be interesting to see what happens. The case is still pending. There are actually a large number of generic defendants involved. So there will certainly be some more activity going forward, and it will be interesting to see how that all plays out. So the last type of petitions we want to talk about refer to different petitions involving NCE exclusivity. Now, I will say one of the larger petitions, larger number of petitions that have been filed over the years relate to various marketing exclusivities. And one of them has been the NCE, or New Chemical Entity Exclusivity. Very quickly, high level, New Chemical Entity means it's a molecule that hasn't been approved before. You essentially get 5 years, and well, I'll make this very simple. You get 5 years of exclusivity. There are a number of permutations to this. But the bottom line for this is it has to be a molecule that has not been approved before that's now getting approval. Well, what we've actually seen in the recent past that has led to a number of petitions over the last year are issues relating to combination products, where you have a combination of an old molecule with a new molecule. And we have primarily seen this with AIDS drugs, but it comes up in other therapeutic categories as well. And FDA has adopted a rule that if you have a combination product and one of the APIs was previously approved, you will not get NCE exclusivity even if the second or third, another API, has not been previously approved. So what this spurned over the last year were a few different petitions. I'll just quickly review some of the facts in these because they are pretty interesting. One was Gilead's petition in January of 2013 relating to Stridelid. It's a product with 4 different actives in it. And what Gilead pointed out is FDA, and what Gilead argues, is that FDA's process here and the rule they've developed really hinges on what gets approved first. If your single entity product gets approved first, and then you later get a combo product approved, and that single entity gets 5 years of exclusivity, and the combo product gets approved, say, in year 2, the combo product will get the benefit of that the remaining number of those 5 years. So in other words, if it's 5 years and there's a few years left, that the combo product's approved, say, in year 2, the combo product gets the benefit of those next couple of years. But if the combo is approved first, there's not going to be NCE exclusivity for anybody. And what Gilead points out here is that is increasingly something that happens when you have these combo products, particularly, again, with AIDS and therapeutic categories like that, and pointed out to FDA or argued that just is not a process, that the order of which you get approved shouldn't determine if you get exclusivity or not, but instead FDA should look at each and every distinct active ingredient in the product. Well, in January, again, there was another petition filed by Ferring. Again, this is a combination product. There's actually 3 actives in this. Didn't get NCE exclusivity. And, Ferring highlighted the fact that there are ethical issues with the way FDA is set up, because sometimes you don't want to, or it's unethical to test the single ingredient in humans, particularly when there may be no efficacy with the single ingredient, and you need to have the multiple ingredients being administered. And what they argue is that FDA's policy is encouraging unnecessary clinical trials and, of course, costs as well. Finally, in April 2013, Bayer filed a petition too, and again, this is on a combination product, again, raising some of the same issues. So, these all petitions that were filed in 2013, FDA is certainly continuing to work on this issue and trying to work through this issue. And in, hopefully the year to come, we'll be seeing FDA actually render some decisions. So that brings us through the part of the presentation focusing on the citizens' petitions. We're now going to spend maybe the last 10 minutes focusing on some of the antitrust issues and pay for delay, and then hopefully have some time for questions left over. So really quickly, just want to broadly talk about, when we say pay for delay, what are we talking about? Well, outside of the pharmaceutical context, typically when you settle a patent case, the alleged infringer is paying some sort of money to the patent holder. That's a typical way. Everyone's kind of familiar that patent cases get settled, and if there's a money exchange, that's the way it flows. In the pharmaceutical industry, and this started a long time ago, we started to see settlements where there was money or consideration flowing from the patent holder, the branded company, to the alleged infringer, the generic company. What that has been referred to, at least in people who are attacking these settlements, they typically refer to them as reverse payment instances, or these pay for delay. And again, it's called reverse payment because you're seeing consideration flowing from the patent holder to the alleged infringer. Now, there are a whole bunch of reasons why this may be necessary. I'll talk about these in a little bit. But wanted to focus on, for years, we were getting decisions out of district courts and various circuit courts coming at this from different perspectives. There were some early cases that were questioning an approach where these payments were being made as violating the antitrust laws. There were later cases, and particularly coming out of the 11th Circuit, where the courts were saying as long as it's within the exclusive confines of the patent, that payments were okay because you have a patent right that's in a supposed monopoly right. But if you think about it very broadly, without getting too esoterical and all the policy discussions, but very broadly, a patent is a grant from the government to very broadly think about it, give you a monopoly over a certain period of time. And that's a conflict, at least a little bit, with the antitrust laws, which is against monopoly and certainly against payments between competitors that further a monopoly. So if you think about those two, the patents and the antitrust laws, you know, right at this intersection where you have these settlements, you have potential for the two laws to conflict with each other. The FTC has been incredibly active in this space. They conduct a number of investigations. For years, they were bringing these cases, doing these investigations, and then, as I mentioned, for years they were losing these cases. And when you talk to them, yeah, they were getting very discouraged, and what they really wanted was either a solution from Congress or they wanted a case to get decided by the Supreme Court. And in 2013, that's what we finally got. We got a decision by the Supreme Court, and that was in this Actavis case. And here, without getting into all the details, but the district court dismissed the claim, saying that there was an antitrust claim brought, saying that there was an alleged payment made by the brand company to the generic company to, quote-unquote, delay generic competition. District court said, I'm not going to look at your likelihood of success on the merits on the patent case. I'm just going to, as a matter of law, dismiss these because they don't raise to an antitrust violation. The 11th Circuit, following a couple different cases that it had previously decided, affirmed that on appeal. And the Supreme Court accepted it, noting that there was a split on whether these cases are presumptively unlawful or not anti-competitive. Now, there are a couple different laws, and this presentation itself, you know, I could go on for hours, and a lot of conferences, these discussions do go on for hours, so I'm going to try and hit the highlights here. But what very broadly, what the Supreme Court did is it rejected the scope of the patent test. And it declined also to adopt what some people were saying, which was a quick look test. Now, the very broadly scope of the patent test basically says as long as the settlement is in the scope of the patent, i.e. it just involves the product that's covered by the patent and it doesn't go beyond the termination, or I'm sorry, the expiration date of the patent, the settlement was okay and didn't raise any antitrust concerns. Other people were saying, well, the court should take a quick look and quickly look, and you know, I often question what does that mean, but a quick look at the patent merits and kind of make a rough determination of whether it's okay. Well, the Supreme Court rejected that as well. And you know, the Supreme Court recognized that there may be a benefit to these settlements, but that sometimes that benefit may benefit the parties but not consumers because it may have anti-competitive effects. And essentially what the Supreme Court did was say that its typical rule of reason test should be applied to these situations. Now, this is really, think about it, with the middle ground between what some of the parties were arguing here. And really what it does is it asks the courts to determine whether a given settlement is an unreasonable restraint on trade, and also to consider any of the benefits that may flow. But the Supreme Court, as it often does, really said that the lower courts need to figure this out and develop all the tests. Well, a couple considerations to keep in mind that came out of the court. You know, the court did say that there may be genuine adverse effects on competition from payments that are made from the branded to the generic companies. And also the court focused on the justifications for settlement. You know, traditionally the court's always talked about that settlements are good things, that they avoid things going up through trial, they save costs, which is a benefit to the economy generally and certainly to the parties and the courts. And there's certainly costs that are avoided to everybody. And the court did recognize that payments that just are reflecting that cost or that are reflecting some other value for services don't necessarily pose antitrust concerns, but the payments need to be justified, and courts need to look at that. Now, the court recognized that the patent holders may have this market power to charge super competitive prices, and that the antitrust litigation that involves a settlement may not be infeasible. There were a lot of arguments saying, if you're looking at the settlement, you're looking at the different terms of the settlement, that's just too hard to do. Well, the Supreme Court said, well, maybe it's not that too hard to do. And the court also said that there may be other ways, and that courts need to consider whether there are other ways to settle these cases. Certainly, as I mentioned before, you need to consider whether the payments exceed the avoided costs of litigation. And I think the courts no doubt will be looking at how big those payments are, and we'll be evaluating that. And from policy perspective, you need to also figure out what this may do. A lot of people have certainly talked about, and I can certainly agree with, it is going to make it harder to settle these cases, to settle paragraph 4 cases. And just the uncertainty over the next 3, 4, 5, 6 years as these cases play out in the lower courts and the lower courts adopt their own test following the Supreme Court's guidance, the uncertainty alone is going to make it harder to settle these cases. Well, that then raises the question, are we going to see less patent challenges because parties and, both from the generics and branded need to realize they may have to go through trial on these? I don't know, but certainly something to consider. But no doubt it will result in less settlements being reached and more cases going to trial. It will be very interesting to see how lower courts deal with assessing the economic issues involved here. They are incredibly complicated. Very sophisticated PhDs have spent decades studying these, and it'll be very interesting to see the courts deal with these. Now, one thing to consider, there have been a lot of settlements in which the branded company has agreed not to launch an authorized generic, at least during the first filer's exclusivity period. And we saw, following the Supreme Court's decision, a lower court in the District of Massachusetts in the Nexium litigation addressed, was the Supreme Court only talking about monetary considerations, or could other things, such as the brand agreeing not to launch an authorized generic, also be considered a reverse payment? And the District of Massachusetts at least said, which is consistent with the position FTC has publicly taken, that other things, other provisions of settlement agreements may be looked at as reverse payments, even though they are not monetary payments. So certainly something to keep in mind as you're going to settle these cases. And just wanted to end this with a reminder that settlement agreements that are found to violate the antitrust laws could lead to a forfeiture of the exclusivity period by the first filer. Now, we haven't seen any of this play out, particularly because for almost a decade FTC had lost all these cases, and quite frankly it just takes a long time for these cases to see their way through the courts anyways. But it is something to keep in mind, particularly if FTC, which they said they will be more aggressive in this area, and as we see the courts go through the different tests and come up with different legal constructs of evaluating these agreements, parties need to be aware that there is a real potential going forward that we may start seeing the forfeiture of exclusivity periods for findings that these settlement agreements do violate the antitrust laws. So on that note, I know we covered a lot of ground in a short period of time, but I definitely wanted to have some time for questions. So I want to certainly thank everybody for their time and attention. I guess I want to encourage everybody before we get to questions, so I don't forget, if you'd like a copy of the presentation, feel free to send me or Momentum an email, and I will certainly get it around. I've also been told by Momentum that it should be available through them and their website with the presentation as well. But I certainly want to open this up for any questions people might have so we can discuss those as well.
Thank you so much, Chad. I hope you can hear me okay. We do have a couple of questions, which I'd love to pose to you if you've got the time. The first one is that you talked about a number of petitions filed over the last year or so. Are there any general takeaways about the citizen petition process that companies should be aware of?
Thanks, Matt. Yeah, no, one thing we often talk to clients about, and I know there's a lot of discussion in the industry too, so it's not necessarily that we're unique in this, but that people in the industry really need to focus not only on the patents that are involved and the patent litigations that are going on with these products, but also focus on citizens petition as another way to accomplish your strategic goals. And I'll say that's both on the branded side and the generic side. Petitions are playing an increasingly important role with how the markets ultimately develop and when they develop. We didn't get into today because there wasn't necessarily, well, the time or a lot of developments in this past calendar year over that. But there have been a number of petitions aimed at approval issues with generic products relating to bioequivalence and things like that parties really need to be focused on because it can impact it from both sides. Again, from the branded side, ensuring longer life for its product, from the generic side, either fighting against that to get on the market quicker, sometimes dealing with these marketing exclusivities that we talked about before. But I guess one of the broader takeaways that people often talk about and we think is important is just keeping this in mind and having it as part of your overall strategy, and not just focusing on the patent issues, but also focusing on these FDA issues as well and these potential petition strategies.
Okay, that's great. Another question that we just had coming in is that REMS are being increasingly used by FDA. What do you see as the challenges relating to REMS going forward as it relates to generic competition?
Yeah, there's been a lot of discussion, and the petitions we talked about here and the Actavis suit we talked about here highlight the problem that if FDA is going to increasingly use REMS to kind of monitor the safety and effectiveness of products, which they certainly are, and I don't have the statistics in front of me, but I can certainly tell you that as more and more products are getting approved with REMS and with certain things to ensure their safe use, they are going to increasingly impact access to these products. So we've seen this kind of recent, I guess you'd call it flood, even though it's only a few, but flood of activity on these petitions and trying to get FDA to intervene and give more guidance to the industry. And if you don't actually see that coming through, it will be very interesting to see the overall impact it has on generic companies getting access to the products. On the flip side of that, ensuring that the products, when access is obtained, are used in the right way, and how that may impact, as we talked about in some of the petitions, how that may impact the product liability issues for the branded companies, because they certainly need to comply with their obligations as well. So I think we will see more of these types of petitions. It will be very interesting to see how, if at all, the Actavis suit is resolved, and then how the companies respond to that going forward.
Okay, and the final question that we have is relates to the Supreme Court's Actavis decision. So how are companies dealing with the Supreme Court's Actavis decision from a practical level in relation to their pending Paragraph 4 litigation?
It is creating, that's a great question. It's creating quite a conundrum for a lot of companies. As you approach these settlements, for a number of years, parties had a number of different things they can settle on, and certainly you start with talking about what the entry date's going to be. But once you get beyond the entry date, parties were getting very creative in coming up with ways to settle these. And just inherent in these settlements is just a problem that some people, the FTC, has a hard time recognizing it, but there's just an inherent problem that the generic companies, as they're litigating, except for litigation costs, there's really nothing else at stake. Lost opportunity, but no actually cost at stake. And on the branded side, there's usually a huge cost at stake. If the generics get on the market, there can be hundreds of millions or billions of dollars at stake with generic entry. So it just creates some very different perspectives when you're talking about an entry date and then what's at risk in going to trial. And that's why we've seen from companies trying to get certainty and trying to establish certainty into their financial models, why we've seen creativity in the settlements. But the Actavis case certainly throws all that into question, and certainly is having parties be much more reluctant in terms of raising different creative solutions to get to these settlements. And it will be very interesting to see in a long-term what the long-term effect is of this, as I mentioned before.
Well, that's great. Thank you so much. Those are all the questions we have, and that takes us up to 1:53. So you get off a few minutes early today, Chad. I want to take this opportunity to really thank you so much for all of the effort and work in making today's presentation possible, and to thank you also to those of you listening who have taken the time out of your busy days in order to attend this webinar. I also want to look forward to meeting a number of you at the forthcoming Biosimilars Conference that's taking place in New York at the end of this month, as well as potentially at a future Paragraph 4 Momentum event down the line. So with that said, I want to thank you very much. This concludes today's webinar. The video of this will be available online. I will send out details to everybody on this call, and as Chad says, the slides will be made available too. So with that being said, thank you very much and have a wonderful day, everybody. Take care.